This was much more about if you had chosen to go onto cloud, which we believe majority of customers have, is what and how. So particularly the how is the kind of the key point. And what I wanted to do for the duration was really kind of focus on three key things. One was to kind of articulate what can go wrong when you're moving towards a cloud journey or when you're moving to a cloud. So what can go wrong? What are kind of typical the issues or the problems that we see when we work with clients and customers? The second was, okay, if that is the case, what do you typically then have to kind of see as reasons? What are the root causes for those issues and these problems? And thirdly, and that's, I guess, the most interesting part, how do I overcome these? How do I address the challenges that we see in cloud migration, cloud transformation, particularly, and given that we work with customers that typically have a significant amount of systems still calling legacy, how do you do that by not breaking your existing environments? Now, I'm not going to cover solutions, so you won't see technical diagrams in here. This is basically around giving you some guidance, some advice, some views, some opinions about what can go wrong, what are the root causes, and how to go about addressing these issues. So first of all, what can go wrong? Now, clearly, if you had read some of the papers or if you had already yourself immersed yourself in cloud transformation, maybe you had some issues in the past. And I just want to really touch on kind of the 7 key challenges that you see, or we typically see when it comes to cloud transformation or cloud migration. Clear context. I typically refer, when I say cloud, I mean all of the clouds, so private, public, hybrid, unless I'm explicit. And secondly, I typically refer to existing landscapes. So to an enterprise that has existing environments like SAP, Oracle, Unix or Windows or so. So typically we see 7 key challenges. First one, sometimes customers move to the cloud and then realize that actually the response times of the business processes that sits behind or is using these applications are slower. Sometimes they're quite surprised because they always thought, oh, I go to the cloud because it's cheaper. Moving to the cloud starting to actually incur additional cost, which had never really factored in the first place. The third is maybe less availability. Now that doesn't have to be the case, of course, if you design it with the right kind of NFR in mind, but sometimes it can have an impact on NFRs or non-functional requirements and therefore availabilities. The fourth might be that once you move to the cloud, sometimes can be quite confusing in terms of customer support. So, you move to a cloud, it's sometimes a bit more complex in terms of who is actually accountable for which part. That can lead to increased complexity. So many customers or customers that we've seen migrating to the cloud actually ending up having not an easier environment. So everything is on the cloud, it's quite easy to manage. It's actually gone more complex. And sometimes also there's a risk of data breach or of compliance issues if maybe you hadn't considered fully the data-related aspects for moving data into the cloud. In particular, very important subject, of course, today in terms of migration of data. And last but not least, sometimes what we can see is when you move from, and again, I mean, you're moving from, say, a legacy or you're moving from an existing environment to a cloud environment, that actually doing changes against this new environment on the cloud is actually more complex or takes longer, is more risky, or actually has more effort. All these things are actually quite surprising for a lot of customers because they assumed I moved to the cloud and it's easier. Now, cloud has EC2 and all these new fancy things. I just moved to the cloud and everything will be easier, will be cheaper, will be faster, will be more secure, and sometimes that's not necessarily the case. Now, if these are the kind of the 7 key symptoms or 7 problems that you can foresee, what are then the reasons for them? Now, I touched on some of them whilst I was explaining these challenges. Let me just quickly go into the 10 key reasons why we see there are problems or issues within migrating to the cloud. The first one is actually a very simple one. A lot of customers, or many customers, have challenges with understanding the here and now. So when you're moving to the cloud from an existing landscape, what you actually have to do is you have to understand your existing landscape. A significant amount of customers actually sometimes have difficulties to actually really pinpoint where are the systems, what applications run on these systems, what data sits on these applications and what business processes are using these data to support an end user, for instance. So it becomes very important to see that some of these issues you saw in the first slide may be caused, maybe directly or indirectly caused, by having not a complete understanding of the as-is, of what's actually there today. The second is when you move to the cloud, again, I mean from traditional to, say, a hybrid model, you have to remember that a lot of applications are, or a lot of business processes, using various different applications. Some could sit on-prem and some could sit in the private or public cloud. Now you have to consider that as a whole solution. So you can't just look at one component, move it to the cloud, and then hoping that the rest will follow. So you need to understand the entire environment. Security, clearly. So must understand what the security implications goes without saying. Sometimes quite tricky to do, particularly when you don't really fully understand what's on the systems. To really do an impact analysis on these will be difficult. One thing that is sometimes surprising is, of course, the amount of data that gets transferred. So say you had an application or a business process that uses 2 applications, that sits on 5 servers in your data center. You pick 2 applications and put them into the cloud. Now what you do is, of course, you extend the connectivity. So they start chatting. And that chatting across the ether, the network, can be quite latency rich, meaning you actually introduce latency and slower response times. So if you don't consider the network-related aspects of the cloud migration, you may have impacts or you may have issues in terms of performance degradation and response times. I think when you heard the presentation this morning, I think Ron alluded to this a couple of times, this integration discussion. So again, when you're moving applications from an on-prem situation, not, say, for instance, you would take the UI or the web-based part of an application, move it to the cloud, which sometimes happens. You must remember there are integration-related aspects, in particular when you integrate across the wire, like we have done in the past with EAI, for instance. You need to consider the endpoints. And integration can be quite complex, and that is certainly something you need to consider before you migrate. Something that's quite boring, but very important, is the service release and change management thereafter. So we sometimes tend to forget that there is a run part to the solution. So we usually have projects migrating something to the cloud and everything goes hunky-dory, but then we'll forget actually the whole release cycle, the change release management, config management, for instance, which again can apply or can bring up some issues and some problems. Cloud is not equal to cloud. So if you go to, or if you migrate to Amazon, Amazon has a very different approach to cloud than Google has, very different to Azure. These are basically different platforms. And if you are selecting a cloud provider, you have to remember that you have to fit into their templating, for instance, and you have to remember that you have to abide by their standard policies and architecture patterns. If you think that cloud is ubiquitous, is easy, is abstracting layers, that's true to a certain degree, because underneath they're still quite dedicated and quite specific. So you have to bear that in mind. And of course, when you're moving to the cloud, you have the technical part. You have the elements that I just mentioned before, like networking and connectivity and change release. But there's a big part also on the people side. So if you had an application that works on, say, traditional client-server, 2-tier application landscape that was been developed, say, over the last 10 to 15 years, you may revise it a bit, or you'll be able to rehost it into, say, Amazon. Now, it's a very different approach to running an application in such a cloud context than it is running it on-prem in your own data center. And the people aspect is something that is typically the biggest issue or problem for moving into the cloud. We had issued a report, which we updated a couple of times, called Cloud Native. And in this report, we surveyed 900 executives. We asked the question, what is the main blocker for you to move into cloud? Number 1 was people and culture. It's not necessarily a technical issue only, it's also the people side which you need to consider. And that's related to the operating model. So if you move parts of your applications or systems that are on-prem currently, been embedded in your CIAM processes or in your ITIL processes, if you move that lock, stock and barrel into the cloud, you need to consider not just the people side, but how you're going to organize these structures and people, the operating model. standard operating model on-prem is very different to an operating model in the cloud. And last but not least, what can go wrong? Sometimes people forget that yes, it is great to have a vision and a strategy, and it's great to follow other leaders like Netflix, for instance, but it needs to work for you. So you need to understand what is your business case. Why are you moving to cloud? Cloud is a means to an end. It's not a target. Cloud enables you to unleash, release capabilities and benefits. I don't see it as your target. I will do cloud because that's my strategy. That's not a strategy. Cloud is an element of, and it is a vehicle or a move or a capability that leads you to more flexibility, more speed, more agility, or it can. Okay, so I promised you 3 key things. The first one was what are kind of the typical issues or problems that we see, the key challenges, the 7 that I mentioned. What are therefore kind of some of the root causes that we typically see, and I only touched on each one, of course, it goes a bit more in detail. But I really wanted to spend a bit more time on kind of I call them the proven remedies. Now, you could argue whether it's right or wrong, but these are the things that we typically apply. So I'm a master certified architect in Capgemini. I'm a vice president in Cloud Infra. And we have a significant amount of customer base worldwide where we do cloud transformations. And these tools, or the tools that you see in a second, are the ones that we usually apply in these contexts or in situations to avoid these challenges and these issues that I mentioned on the first slide. So what are kind of the key elements of a successful cloud journey? Well, what are the first one? The first one, as I mentioned before, clearly, and it is something you cannot underestimate. Sounds really boring. So it's very boring in terms of, I know my own stuff. I know my asset management. I know my CMDB. I have an asset register. I know where the servers are. Most of the time, that's not enough. You need to know a bit more. How much more? I'll show you in a second. The second is you need to develop and you need to really understand the end-to-end solution. I mentioned when you move to cloud, I have not seen yet at least, a full-blown big bang cloud migration, so where you move everything one step to the cloud. You do it usually in steps. And therefore, if you do it in step, you take one element out of your existing landscape into the, say, public cloud, say on Amazon. You need to understand the end-to-end solution. You can't just focus on that cloud element or the cabling between cloud and the data center. You need to look at the entire solution. And solution there, I mean a solution from a business process perspective. The third is, and I'll go a bit more in detail after this, but the third was really kind of consider 3 key dimensions. First is understand business process, and the impact it has on the business process. Think very clearly around the applications. Clearly, applications in terms of capabilities that you're moving. And then thirdly, and that's typically what we usually like to focus on, because that's the infrastructure side. But as I mentioned to you before, infrastructure is important, but the first 2 are as, if not more important. You need to understand the business and the application side. Goes without saying a bit maybe, but I do want to kind of make this point, have a plan. So when you do your cloud migration, don't just go and say, let's move to the cloud. You need to have a very clear plan of how to approach it, whether you need to do a discovery, whether you need to do a design, what are the steps you have to go through to do your blueprinting, for instance. And you must ensure that you cover your operating model, covering your technology, people, and process. I mentioned this before. It's quite important to really kind of consider, and not just the technology side, but really think about your first line, your second line, your third line, your developers, the people interacting with the applications from all sides, end users, consumers, but also your system management engineering community. Fifth, business case. Again, goes without saying, but a business case in terms of TOTEX, so total cost of ownership, not just CapEx or OpEx, but really understand what are the full true costs for migrating. Time and time again, I see customers coming to me saying it's more expensive because all of my hardware is written off. I don't actually pay anything for my data center because I own it myself. Now I move to the cloud, to Amazon, they charge me every hour. That's a new charge I never had before. So you need to consider that before you make a decision of moving to the cloud. And last but not least is any change you do, you may see it as a technical change. You may see, I move Sun Solaris to AWS, or I create a container and I put some Linux, and there's a technical change. Any change you do has a business impact. It may be that the business process is faster, maybe it's more flexible, but it has a business impact. And you need to consider that to also get buy-in from the business that this is the right direction of travel for you as an organization. So I mentioned 6 points. I hope you're still with me. I know it's in the afternoon. No windows in here, yet lovely weather outside. I know it's hard, but there are kind of 3 things I wanted to talk to you before about. Was first the issues that we saw, the reasons to why they're there, and now I'm going to go a bit into those 6 points, just show you one slide to put a bit more flesh behind these points. So let's go. Let's go on to the first one. So when I mentioned, you remember I mentioned the as-is. Now you may say, well, that's good. So I know my as-is, but what do you actually mean by as-is? And this is a reference model that we use to kind of articulate what's the meta model of an as-is. So what are the attributes that you need to collect to have a good as-is information? Well, you clearly need information around your install base. You need to have a view from an information perspective. You need to have a view from a commercial perspective, and you need to understand the business processes that this application is supporting. So this is really about putting these elements together and connecting them to an asset like an application or an infrastructure asset. So you need to have a look on all these angles to understand what's running on it, how it's consuming it, and what is the impact basically, and that's the basis of making the assessment, what's the impact of moving this from a security, from a latency, or from a applications perspective. I mentioned this before. I think, so this is not me personally, we completely underestimate the power and the importance of this. For those of you who've been in the IT for longer, you probably agree, we sometimes go too fast into solution and too little into the as-is. Now, I'm not saying you do a full analysis, which takes half a year, but you need to have a good enough understanding on those attributes. If you don't, you may run the risk of achieving these challenges that are articulated in the first slide. Second, I mentioned this end-to-end solution. Well, end-to-end solution is really kind of around your traditional, I sometimes refer to legacy. Legacy is actually quite a negative word. It has a negative connotation. They're still traditional solutions. They're still delivering business value, most of them. But applications that are following the traditional application stack have a very specific blueprint. They have a very specific way of working with them, i.e., your dev to life cycle, your waterfall, how you maintain them, how to change them. And your cloud native, so the stuff that sits cloud native in the clouds, which are newly written, are very different. Now, there are 2 different templates, there are 2 different solutions. And if you're moving applications, or you're mixing traditional and cloud native, particularly when you move to a hybrid cloud from an existing landscape, you have to remember that, and you need to have a solution that covers both sides, not just the cloud native. Third, discover all the dimensions. So all the dimension means when you look at your existing landscape, and by landscape I mean applications, infrastructure, the people, you really need to consider the business, the applications, as well as the infrastructure side. I mentioned to you we have tools in Capgemini. As one tool was EAPM. Is a tool that we use to mimic and model the implications and model the landscape. But we can do this on an application and on an infrastructure perspective with a business view on site as well. That's clearly important when you, for instance, do a discovery. So when you say, oh, I would like to go to the cloud, so I first need to understand what's there, so I then can design what I want to have in my cloud. Typically, for many of us, we typically focus on infrastructure and application. You need to think about business process. What are the steps that the application is supporting, and what happens if I move that step into the cloud? Make it faster, make it positive, but it still will have an impact on the end users. Have a plan. So a plan, again, around kind of 3 key areas really, or the plan needs to consider 3 key areas. One is the entire portfolio side. So really kind of going through your application portfolio, understanding which ones you can rehost, revisit, which ones you have to rebuild, refactor, which ones you have to change, but they are quite a technical view to the technology. The second is to think about the landing platform, so where do you actually want to end up in? So what is your target in terms of technology, but also the target in terms of the way you're going to support your technology. And then And for me, again, the most important part is actually the latter part, is to think about the operating model. So once you had your technology and your landing platform, so where you want to end up, you really need to think about, who's going to support it, how are you going to support it, and how are you going to organize yourself to support it. Open Group had issued a framework called IT4IT. For those of you who have seen it, for those of you who haven't, have a look at it. It does give you great insights in terms of what are the typical capabilities that digital organizations need nowadays, and how they should organize themselves in order to make take most advantage of the cloud move. The business case, again, clearly business case is a really important point. Within the business case, I thought I'd show you quickly two figures that I felt are quite important in terms of changing to a cloud. So this comes from our research that we had issued back in February 2017, and we researched, or we questioned 902 executives. And you can see that, I'm not going to go through all the details, but there are certain reasons to why people will move, and there are certain, certain impacts that they have to consider. So when you're creating your business case, yes, of course, it's financial, it's commercial, but you also need to understand what are kind of value propositions you're getting out of a cloud migration. And understanding the reasons for doing it is really important, particularly when it comes to migrating complex systems or critical systems. And gain full business sign-in or buy-in. Sometimes, sometimes I work with customers, CTO, CIO levels. They see sometimes the cloud transformation as purely kind of a technology upgrade, as a bit of a refresh. So I move from, it's not quite true, of course, but I move from a certain technology platform to a new one. Cloud is transformational. Cloud has a massive impact on operating model, on the way you structure yourself from a technology perspective, the way you see data, and can unlock a huge amount of benefits. So if you underestimate that, just see it as a technical change, then you may not go, or you may not achieve actually your ambition from a business case perspective. And you need to make sure that the board is fully signed in to moving to the cloud, and you have that sponsorship from the business. By business, I mean the application owners, the people who own the applications, who deliver the business value from an organizational perspective. So, I know lots of numbers in here. I realized now I had 7, and then 10, and then 6. So, but it's really kind of talking about the key learnings that we had moving to the cloud. Remember, I was very contextualizing around talking from moving from legacy or traditional to a cloud context. Cloud native is different. If you build new in the cloud, you don't have these issues because you build new in the cloud. If you come from existing, then you have to consider the points that I mentioned, or we're suggesting you consider the points. Now, it can be that cloud is a simple lift and shift, but it can also be a full rebuild. And as I offered, there's the 7, 10, 6. So there might be 7 challenges that you need to consider with 10 probable causes and maybe 6 proven remedies. Before I finish, I know I've got another 55 seconds left, and I'm German, so I'm always on time. There are, sorry, I couldn't resist. There are a couple of key things really for success. So one is, I know I mentioned this, but the business buy-in. It's not a technical sell, it's a business sell. You really need to consider that. It's understand your current, don't forget, it might be boring to look into what's there, but if you do it properly, it will help you a great deal when you do your transformation. Think holistically, end to end, so think about traditional and cloud native. Don't just go cloud all the time. Think about your lovely old AIX systems that are sitting there delivering value for you for the last 10 or 15 years, and not just these new Kubernetes and Docker containers. And really have a plan. So, and have a plan sometimes can also say, have somebody with you who's done it before and maybe is more impartial to help you along that journey. And that means, another 4 seconds, that's the Cloud Native report that I mentioned. If you Google Cloud Native comes of age, you can get the whole report. Really insightful in my perspective, or from my perspective, gives you lots of argumentation and analysis and data around cloud journey. And with that, I thank you for listening to me for 25 minutes. Thank you.